Today we have stories of ghosts and Halloween customs from all over the world. And to listen to these stories, we have an audience of 6th and 7th graders from Kennedy Middle School. This first story I found in the October issue of Cricket Magazine, and the name of the story is The Ghost Seller, and it comes from China. Zhong Dingbai was a jaunty young man from Nanyang, and he was on his way to a distant city, to the city of Yuan. He was walking along the road, and far ahead of him, he saw a man who seemed to walk with a strange, floating gait. He'd never seen anyone walk quite that way. Dingbai quickened his pace to catch up with the man. He looked over at him and he said, "Who are you?" The man looked at Dingbai, and in a voice as thin as paper, he said, "I am a ghost." Dingbai thought quickly. A ghost might try to harm me. I must come up with a quick answer. He said, "I too am a ghost, and I am on my way to the city of Yuan." "I am going there too," said the real ghost. "Let us go together." They marched on for a few miles, and then the ghost said to Dingbai, "It would be easier if we carried each other. I will carry you first." So the ghost picked up Dingbai, and as he walked along, he said, "My, you are very heavy for a ghost." "Well, I have died recently," said Dingbai. "That is why I have not yet gotten rid of all of this mortal weight." And when it was Dingbai's turn to carry the ghost felt like nothing at all. "Tell me," said Dingbai to the ghost, "now that I am dead, what should I fear most from the still living?" And the ghost said, "Saliva." "What?" said Dingbai. "Spit," said the ghost. "If a mortal spits on a ghost, it is frozen forever in whatever shape he takes." Oh, ghosts are very angry when that happens. I could tell you terrible tales of what we ghosts would like to do to human beings, and the ghost proceeded to do so. Then they came to a stream, and the ghost walked across the water, and as he did so, there was not a single ripple as he walked. But when Dingbai walked across the stream, there were great waves on either side of his feet as he strode across the water. The ghost looked at him suspiciously. "Oh, I really haven't caught on to this business of being a ghost very well," said Dingbai. I will use you as an example. I will try to be as good a ghost as you are." Now they were near the city of Yuan, and quickly Dingbai picked up the ghost and held him tight on his shoulders. "Put me down," said the ghost. But Dingbai ran right into the city, right into the marketplace, and when he put down the ghost, it immediately turned into a horned goat. And right away, Dingbai spat on the goat, and it was frozen there forever as a goat. Well, when Dingbai recovered his composure, he took the goat and sold it for 1,500 pieces of gold. And in China today, they have the saying, "To Zhong Dingbai we raise a toast. For good hard cash, he sold a ghost." Now, this next story comes from the islands of Orkney, which are north of Scotland, right here. Now, all over the world, there are many Halloween customs about things that girls do to find out what man they are going to marry. Did any of you ever hear of the custom of if you take an apple and you peel it and you get the peeling all in one long piece, and then you throw it over your shoulder and you see what initial it makes? And that's supposed to be the initial of the man you're going to marry. And another trick is you walk down the cellar stairs backwards holding a mirror in front of you, and if you see any boy's face in the mirror, that's supposed to be who you're going to marry. Well, in this story, there is a custom called winnowing, which you take scissors and you put them in a sieve, and you shake the sieve around 99 times, and then you look up, and you're supposed to see the face of the man you're going to marry. Mrs. Bow and her stepson, Johnny, came in the door one Halloween night. They had spent the whole day out in the fields, bringing in the last bit of the summer's crops. Jessie, who was almost 15, Johnny's sister, had cooked a good dinner, and they washed their hands before they ate. Mrs. Bow washed her hands and sat down, and then Johnny washed his hand in the wash basin, and then he spat in the water. "Why did you do that for?" said Jessie. "That's disgusting. Why did you spit in the wash basin?" "So stepmother and I won't fight," said Johnny. "That's a stupid old custom," said Jessie. And Johnny and Mrs. Bow sat down and ate their dinner. And they didn't notice that Jessie had a little bit of red ribbon in her hair. And after dinner, Mrs. Bow and her stepson, Johnny, were discussing the crops of the year and how next year they really needed to buy a new plow. And they didn't notice when Jessie took the scissors and the sieve and went out to the barn. When Jessie came back, she looked very sad and dejected, and she sat down on the chair with a sigh. Mrs. Bow looked over, saw the red ribbon in her hair, and said, "Jessie, it's Halloween. I forgot. Were you out winnowing?" Jessie nodded. "Did you whirl the sieve around 99 times? Jessie nodded again. "And who did you see?" "I saw no one," said Jessie. "Well, maybe next year," her stepmother said. "What are you women talking about?" said Johnny. And they explained the old custom to Johnny of how girls would spin the scissors around 99 times and then see the face of the man that they were to marry. "What a stupid old custom." "Well, Jessie," said Johnny, "I guess you're going to be an old maid. You'll have to cook for me for the rest of your days." "No," said her stepmother. "Next year she'll see someone's face." "Tell us, stepmother," said Johnny, Did you do this winnowing when you were young?" "I did. I certainly did." "Did you ever see anyone's face?" "Yes," said Mrs. Bow, "and I will tell you about it. You, Jessie, you were just a baby, and you, Johnny, were just toddling around, and your mother was very, very sick, and I was here to take care of her. It was Halloween, and your father had gone to Kincaid to sell some cattle, and I waited until you, Jessie, were asleep in your crib, and you, Johnny, were in your bed, dozing off, and your mother was sitting in that chair, sick-like in front of the fire. And then I took the scissors and the sieve, and I went out to the barn. Oh, I was hoping I would see the face of that servant lad on the next farm. I thought he was very handsome, and I spun the scissors around 99 times, and I looked up, and there was your father, home early. I was surprised. I didn't expect him for a few more days. And then when I went into the house and your mother was awake, and I said to your mother, "Your husband's home. He came back early." And your mother looked at me and she said, "You were out winnowing, weren't you?" And I nodded. And then she looked at me with eyes I will never forget. And she said, "Take good care of my children." "Well, then did Father come in?" said Johnny. "No, your father was still at market." Well, then it was someone else you'd seen, right?" said Jessie. "No, it was your father's face I had seen." And the next spring, your mother died, and the lad I fancied married another girl, and your father asked me to marry him. And I've looked after you ever since. And Jessie looked at her stepmother and she said, "And so you have." "So you have what?" said Johnny. "Been good to us," said Jessie. I like that story because that's a nice story about stepmothers, right? There's so many bad stories about stepmothers. I think it's time we had a good one. This next story comes from the Highlands of Scotland, and it's called The Weeping Lass at the Dancing Place by Sora Nic Leos. Outside of every Scottish village is a place where the roads come together in a triangle, and there the ground is pounded down hard from the feet of many young folks dancing. They come there to dance outside their village, and on a warm summer's night, a long, long time ago, outside a certain village in Scotland, the young folks come trooping in the moonlight. Some lads were riding their shaggy Highland ponies with their lasses in back of them. Others had the girls on their arm. Some came without partners, but as soon as the dancing started, they all found someone to dance with. There was no fiddle, no pipes. The only music was the sound of their singing, and they danced reel after reel. There was one lass who come by herself. She danced with no one. She sat at the edge of the hedge and wept. 3 months before, in the spring, her lover had died. He had drowned. He was a fisherman out with the herring boats, and his boat went down. His body had been washed ashore in a distant village, and he'd been buried there. Well, every day and every night since she'd heard the news of her lover's death, she'd done nothing but cry and lament and mourn. She was sad that she could not go visit his grave and sit beside the grave and cry her tears right there. After a while, down the road there come a black horse with a man riding on it. No one had seen him before. He was a stranger. He hopped off his horse and joined the dancers. His voice was louder than any of the others, and he jumped higher in the dances, and they danced reel after reel, but the lass still sat there by the hedge, crying and crying. At last, one by one, all the other young people went away, and the only ones left were the stranger on the black horse and the weeping lass. And he come over to her, and he looked at her, and he said, "You would be a bonny, bonny lass if you would stop your crying. Your eyes are all red and swollen. Come, dance with me." "Nay," she said, "I swore I would never dance nor sing again. My lover died 3 months ago, and I will mourn him for the rest of my life." "You should not cry so over the dead. It does disturb them," said the stranger. "Come, dance with me." She said no, but he grabbed her, and he was stronger than she, and he whirled her about the dancing place, and as they whirled faster and faster, a shaft of moonlight hit his face, and she saw that it was the man she had thought dead. "They told me you died," she said. "Is that what they said?" said the stranger. "They said you were buried in a village far from here." "They told you that, did they? I will never be parted from you again," she said. "But I must leave this place before dawn," he said. "I will go with you. Wherever you go, I will be there with you." "You will not like where I dwell now," he said. "It's low and damp and cold. But with me working too, we'll soon earn enough money for a better place." "Then come with me, if you must," he said. And he pulled the lass up and back of him on the horse, and the horse sped off down the road in the moonlight. They were going so fast, and a chill wind blew. The lass drew her shawl about her. She thought that the wind and the cold came from the great speed they were traveling at, for it was a summer's night. And then she felt the garments of her lover, and they were damp and cold. It was as if he'd been riding through a rainstorm, but the weather had been fair. And then all of a sudden her shawl blew up in her face, and as she fought it down, and she grasped a hold of his shirt, and it was wringing wet. "Oh, it's as if we'd been driving through a storm," she said, "but my clothes are dry." The man said naught. And at last they came to the distant village where there was the kirk and the kirkyard with many graves. He rode up to one of the graves, and he dismounted, and he said, "This is where I dwell now, And this is where you wish to stay with me. All the tears and all your lamenting have given me no peace since the day I died. My clothes are soaked and wet from all your tears. But you will now dwell with me, and I will have peace. And he looked up at her, and now she saw that his face was a skull, and under his clothes were naught but bones. She jumped off the horse and started to run down the road, and he ran after her. He grabbed hold of her shawl, and she dropped the shawl and ran as fast as ever she could down the road. Just then, the sun come up, and the cocks crowed, and the ghost disappeared. The lass was so frightened she fell down in a dead faint, and a milkmaid found her and got help. When she told the villagers what had happened to her, first they thought she was daft. First they thought she dreamed it, but then one of the men who was tidying up the graves found a bit of cloth with fringe on it. He tried to pull it out of the ground, but he could not. They got shovels and dug deep and found that the shawl was trapped inside a coffin. They asked the minister if they could open the coffin, and when they did, they found the edge of the shawl clasped in the bony fingers of the skeleton that had belonged to the lover of the lass. Well, she went back home, and she mourned no more for her dead lover, lest he come back and try to carry her away again. Now, this last story comes from the Ozark Mountains in the middle of the United States, and it is called The House the Dovers Didn't Move Into by Ida Chittum. The Dovers were a numerous and boisterous lot. They just had a lot of children, and they were always having a good time. They were fearless until the night that they spent at the house they didn't move into. Oh, sure, those children, as they were walking down to the river, they always stepped carefully to avoid the copperheads, but that was just common sense, not fear. The Dovers were a lean and agile family from picking. They picked potatoes, they picked corn, they picked strawberries and apples, but mostly they picked rocks. It seemed like the front yard of every house they lived in was just covered with rocks, and for Pa to plant anything, the children had to pick out all the rocks, and then another layer of rocks would come up to the surface. Now, the thing about rock picking, it just is not satisfying, because you can't pop a rock into your mouth like a can of strawberry. Even so, the Dovers were a happy, big family. 2 or 3 times a year, Pa would move them to a different house. And the Dover children just loved the adventure of moving into a new house with a lot of exploring to do. And all the houses they moved into had names. There was the Hill Place, the Brinkman Farm, the Grayson farmstead. And back of all these houses were little graveyards where the people were buried who'd lived in the house before. The house the Dovers was moving into today was called the Kelly Place, and the last folks who had lived there had died, but not pleasantly. And as they pulled up to the Kelly Place, the yard was just full of dirt and cinders. But as Mama always said, just takes a lot of young'uns running around to make a place look real homey-like. And as soon as Pa pulled the wagon up to the house, the young Dovers just jumped out of the wagon like a sack full of grasshoppers, all ages and sizes jumping around. Now, the oldest boy was named Long, and he was dependable and strong. And he and Papa first took the table down from the wagon, and then they took the bench that Pa had made about 6 children ago, and pots and pans and quilts and food, and then felt around in her mouth to see if she'd eaten any rocks. And then Jenny began the job of getting supper ready. She got the fire started, and she took the big iron pot and filled it half full of water and put in some beans to start cooking them. Then she made up a batch of biscuits, and she fried them in a skillet that matched the pot, and it was then that they began to get an inkling that something was not right. Lily and Bobby come running up to Jenny. "Shadows! After us!" They hugged Jenny tight, and their words were smothered in her cotton dress. Well, Jenny just sat Lily and Bobby right down on a mattress and fed them each a biscuit. And soon all the Dovers was gathered around eating their supper of beans and biscuits, and the darkness surrounded them like a blanket. Bedtime. Did the Dovers need to be told twice? They washed up real quick and all fell asleep just like that. A couple hours later, Jenny woke up. She heard footsteps out beyond. She heard heavy sounds of breathing. Long, wake up. And Long drew a blanket around his shoulders and come over near the fire where Jenny was, and they looked out in the darkness, and they saw great shadows. The shadow of a huge man appeared, and behind him the shadows of two smaller men. And they were yelling and cussing at each other, and from the shadows come the smell of hate. And as Jenny and Long watched, the big shadow started to run around the house, running for his life. And the other two shadows took off after him, running for his death. When they come around the house again, the two men tripped the big man, and he fell down to the ground, and they started beating him. And Long said, I will not stand by and watch them murder that man. And he raced toward the shadows. And Jenny said, Long, come back. They're not real. But the shadows turned on Long, and Jenny ran after her brother and brought him back to the safeness of the firelight. And as Jenny and Long